Before we get started with today's video, I wanted to talk quickly with you all about StormChaserCoaching. Most of you all know that for the past 5 years of my channel, I have been on a journey to conquer my lifelong storm anxiety through learning more about meteorology and the science behind the storm. Empowering myself through knowledge has been the most transformative tool, and for the first time, I'm actually excited to get into storm chasing this year. So when I was approached to co-found and join StormChaserCoaching with Gabriel Harbour and Trey Greenwood, I knew this was the perfect opportunity to help others who were exactly like myself. If you've ever wanted to learn more about radar, weather models, or how chasing actually works or how to get started, whether you're experienced or completely new to the community, we've got free resources for you. Head over to StormChaserCoaching.com and click the free button in the menu, and there you'll find ebooks, podcast episodes, and our awesome free community of weather lovers and chasers that we love so very much. The link is in the description below. We would love for you to join us on this journey. Now, let's get into the video.
Your radio or TV is a lifeline of information, broadcasting safety rules and storm bulletins. Keep it turned on until the tornado watch is over. The tornado may pass you by. Odds are in favor of it, but don't bet your life on it.
The mystery and power of tornadoes have inspired fear, curiosity, and awe in artwork and literature for hundreds of years. Before tornado sirens or warnings, people could only rely on their instinct and the rise of the black winds. The path to the modern tornado warning wasn't a straight or easy one. It's a history rife with resistance, scientific breakthrough, and hard-learned lessons. Today, we're diving into the convoluted history of the American tornado warning, from its earliest beginnings in Native American folklore to the forbidden tornado forecast, all the way to the turning points that helped shape the system that we rely on to this day. So with that, I give to you the convoluted past, present, and future of the American tornado warning. In order for us to discuss the history of the American tornado warning, it's important that we start from the very beginning. The earliest known accounts of tornadoes in the modern-day United States, of course, come from Native American tribes. Drawings and recordings by Native American tribes in Norman, Oklahoma date back to, at the very least, the Silver Horn calendar in 1828 that recorded instances of tornadoes, including one depiction of the Great Cyclone Summer of 1905. Though the Native American experience with tornadoes predates the settlers' first depictions by hundreds and hundreds of years. Moving now to the first accounts from American settlers, we start with the first potential report of a tornado, coming from July 5th of 1643 by then Massachusetts Governor John Winthrop, writing, quote, "A sudden violent wind gust tore down trees and lifted up a meeting house in Newbury, with people still inside." By the mid to late 1700s in the United States, forecasting was essentially limited to practices of simple weather observations that the colonists had learned from European techniques. This would include the use of thermometers and barometers, even by some of our founding fathers, notably Thomas Jefferson, who was an avid weather observer himself. In the decades that followed, while weather observation with these simple instruments would become more popularized, tornadoes weren't seen as a priority by the scientific community at the time. The interest in weather forecasting, however, was about to change in a big way in the next century. April 1st, 1845. The first commercial telegraph line is established in the United States, marking a significant improvement to American lives by providing rapid, long-distance communication for businesses, military, news dissemination, and for the upcoming meteorological community. For the first time, weather data that's being collected by individuals could be transmitted and analyzed in near real time, allowing a network of observers to begin building a larger picture of atmospheric conditions. One of the earliest visionaries behind this was Joseph Henry, who was the first secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. In one Smithsonian report, he wrote that the time was, quote, auspicious for commencing an enterprise of meteorological observations, particularly with reference to the phenomena of American storms. With a $1,000 investment, Henry purchased thermometers and barometers, helping to establish a national weather observation network. These observations would then be compiled into the very first weather maps in the United States. And that brings us now to the critical year of 1870. A moment when scientists, armed with more data than ever before, were ready to take the next leap, turning observations into forecasts. In 1870, Congress authorizes the creation of a National Weather Service, with then President Ulysses S. Grant signing it into law on February 9th. This creation of a military-led system was chosen for its ability to deliver timely and disciplined reports. By 1872, 24-hour forecasts would be issued nationwide, and by 1874, these forecasts would include wind, pressure, and temperature forecast, distributed to thousands of post offices across the country. And for the very first time in American history, the average citizen could plan their day ahead based on the weather forecast. This was a groundbreaking system and should have been the early beginnings of tornado forecasting as well. And from here, we're about to enter a long, painful stretch of history for tornado science and tornado forecasting to exist and to be taken seriously. This context is leading up to one of, if not the most famous figures in the history of tornado forecasting. Born on April 11th of 1854 in Ann Arbor, Michigan, John P. Finley studied climate and agriculture at what is now Michigan State University, graduating in 1873 with a degree in science. In 1877, Finley joins the U.S. Army Signal Service just as the National Weather Service was beginning to expand. Assigned to the Philadelphia Signal Office, Finley developed a growing interest in severe storms and had a particular affinity for tornadoes. By 1882, Finley was stationed in Kansas City, where he began traveling through the Midwest and Great Plains, building what would become one of the first tornado observation networks. He recruited spotters and observers who sent him first-hand reports, photographs, illustrations, and diagrams of storms, an early version of the data networks or spotter networks that we still use to this very day. As a Signal Corps officer and meteorologist, Finley published groundbreaking work on tornadoes and severe weather. His most notable contributions of many include Tornadoes, What They Are and How to Observe Them, followed by Tornadoes, What They Are and How to Escape Them, his 15 Rules for Tornado Forecasting, which was a remarkably advanced guide for its time. I even bought a John Finley book just for this video, just in case I need to understand how to escape tornadoes better. At this point in Finley's career, locals in tornado-prone regions are becoming more than familiar with the existence of these storms. The need for observation and advancement in the tornado science realm is glaringly apparent. And this all culminates to Finley's initial research phases on tornadoes around 1884, when the U.S. Army Signal Corps authorized Finley to run experimental tornado forecasts based on his extensive methodology. On March 10th of 1884, Finley would begin issuing 8-hour predictions for tornadoes using morning weather maps, highlighting areas with favorable tornado conditions. His forecast had an astounding 95 to 96% success rate over a 3-month period. On average, it gave people 5 hours of lead time to prepare for tornadoes. It was nothing short of revolutionary. But despite this data, the U.S. Army Signal Corps shut the experiment down in 1886 due to internal politics and skepticism of the validity of the data. By 1887, Finley is somewhat ousted from his own positions in severe weather research as he loses favor in Washington. Signal Service Chief General Greeley demands that the forecast be discontinued entirely, saying, quote, "It is believed that the harm done by such a prediction of a tornado would eventually be greater than that which results from the tornado itself." And just like that, almost as quickly as it began, tornado forecasting is axed. It's now 1890, and the United States Weather Enterprise collectively is at a fork in the road. Tensions had been simmering between military control of the weather branch as it currently stood and the desire for there to be civilian interest. These discussions largely sparked by two devastating events. The first being the 1888 children's blizzard, an event near the Great Lakes which saw the deaths of many children, school teachers, and parents who were caught in a blizzard completely unwarned. And the second event being the Great Blizzard of 1890, of which, once again, the civilians had no warning for. These warnings in and around the Great Lakes would have been given to military or commercial shipments, but were failed to be given to the local residents. So, on October 1st of 1890, then President Benjamin Harrison signs the act that will transfer the meteorological responsibilities of the Signal Service to the Department of Agriculture, seeing the U.S. government transfer the responsibilities of weather forecasting from a military to a civilian agency. This new agency would be known as the United States Weather Bureau, a name it would hold until 1970 when the National Weather Service is born. Forecasting and certain storm warnings were suddenly available everywhere, yet and still, when it comes to tornadoes, the United States Weather Bureau refuses to accept their prevalence in the United States, despite the fact that that very same year, in 1890, a deadly tornado tore through Louisville, Kentucky, offering a very grim counterpoint to the Bureau's skepticism. Not to mention other prolific outbreaks and meteorological events that happened in the years prior during Finley's prime of tornado study, like the Enigma outbreak, for example, of 1884, a prolific and catastrophic southeastern outbreak. There was still some progress for storm warnings generally, like the implementation of flood warnings by the Weather Bureau in 1891 and the establishment of hurricane warning networks in 1898. But just because the Weather Bureau itself didn't believe in the validity of tornado forecasts, that didn't mean there wasn't chatter about it in the general public. Several pages in the monthly Weather Review begin to write articles and snippets of the public curiosity on tornado forecasting that was beginning to bloom. One article in 1899 questioned the lack of tornado warnings for events, writing, quote, "Is it not possible in these days of telephones and telegraphs to send a warning to others in its course?" But the Weather Bureau's stance remains firm, writing a counterpoint. The likelihood of injury to any one person was too small to justify the issuance of warnings. The panic might do more harm than the storm itself. And just like that, once again, tornado forecasting remains on ice, despite growing awareness, growing technology, and a growing body count. We're fast forwarding to the 20th century. The Weather Bureau still doesn't have a centralized collection point for even tornado reports in the aftermath until 1916. And by the way, in the early 1900s, this disdain really for tornado forecasting and warning is so intense that it has led to the actual ban of not only tornado forecasting, but the use of the word tornado itself in any public broadcast or forecasting period. This forecasting ban on tornadoes and the banning of the word tornado itself was official and would be further reinforced in the years 1915 and again in 1934. The only workaround for being able to warn local residents of a very obvious tornado should it be occurring was for the use of a severe thunderstorm warning. One notable example of this actually comes from May 26 of 1896 during the morning forecast for St. Louis, when the forecast read, quote, "conditions favorable for local severe storms." 225 locals would lose their lives in one of the most destructive tornadoes in the nation's history at the time. Yet, and still, the ban on the word tornado and tornado forecasting would remain. All of this background and context so far is leading into what will become the first tornado forecasts and warnings. But again, we would be remiss not to mention the banning of the word tornado itself, which lasted for several decades, from the late 1880s all the way effectively into the 1940s. Do I think this was an intentional decision with some nefarious undertone? No, I don't. I think that the intentions there were to not harm the public by creating fear and panic, though those intentions are quickly covered by the fact that these are the leading scientists in the nation who are responsible for fully understanding the greater picture and encouraging the research and advancement of the science, and they simply refuse to do so. As a result, residents in tornado-prone areas learn to rely on signs in nature and their own senses to warn of approaching severe weather. A systematic approach to tornado forecasting was exactly the same in 1940 as it was in 1870. As we're shifting now to the early to mid 20th century in American history, we're stepping into a pivotal chapter, not just in tornado history, but of course for American history as well. The early to mid 20th century in American history is marred with devastation, catastrophe, war, economic upheaval, grief, and also sweeping change in technology, culture, and public policy, and the Weather Bureau was no exception to this change. While the weather enterprise doesn't change much during the First World War or Great Depression, it would be on December 8th of 1941, as the United States officially enters the Second World War, that forecasting became a matter of national security. Weather observations and forecasts were subject to heavy censorship to minimize their use by invading forces. This was largely because of the United States' geographical advantage. With weather systems moving eastward across the Atlantic, the United States was able to detect systems and patterns before they reached Europe. To protect this advantage, weather data became classified. Forecasts were heavily coded, and civilian forecasts were reduced to extraordinarily vague statements. Things like, "the weather will be warmer tomorrow," or "today is a good day to cut hay." Restrictions would eventually ease a bit in 1943, and of course, following the end of World War II in 1945, would be lifted entirely. What I find most interesting from Marlene Bradford's book during this period in time is how much she elaborates on the average American's experience with tornadoes and severe storms during wartime, particularly how American workers in factories that manufactured and munitions were often in tornado-prone regions of the Midwest and Great Plains. Because of this, the workers in factories heavily relied on severe thunderstorm warnings and accurate forecasts at the time in the event that they needed to quickly evacuate the buildings that were highly explosive, in the event that even a destructive thunderstorm got too close. Even with this fact, the ban on tornado forecasting, even at a local level, and the ban on the word tornado continues. Following the end of World War II, restrictions on forecast censorship begin to ease, and we're just 2 years away now from the first official tornado forecast that many of you are already familiar with. But it's actually here around 1943, a couple of years before the first official tornado forecast, that on a civilian level, particularly in the Great Plains, that locals in Kansas City and Wichita are beginning to be encouraged by radio announcements to report tornado sightings to their local Weather Bureau offices, to which the local Weather Bureau office would relay their report downstream for anyone who might be impacted by a spotted tornado. These are essentially spotter network reports. These sneaky local level tornado reports and warnings, to me, should be a bigger deal, because although they aren't official government issued tornado warnings, they are effectively the first real warnings of impending tornadoes that are broadcast via radio and that are actually making a difference to the average American citizen. We've finally reached the turning point in tornado forecasting, an event that most of you will be familiar with. March 20th, 1948. Air Force meteorologist Captain Robert Miller is on duty at the Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma City. The 9 p.m. forecast at the base calls for gusty winds without thunderstorms. But by 9:30 p.m., that forecast proved to be inaccurate when thunderstorms begin to progress 20 miles southwest of the base. Miller, observing these quite aggressive supercells on the APQ-13 radar screen, realized that it was headed for the military base. Miller quickly types up a typical thunderstorm warning for the airport, but the quickly approaching storms made it too late to secure the base or the planes. The tornado moved through the base, blowing out the control tower windows and damaging 17 C-54s, 15 P-47s, and 2 B-29s. A prompt military investigation the very next day into this incident saw Major Ernest J. Fawbush explaining that there was both a difficulty to forecast tornadoes and a major reluctance of the civilian and military officials to issue tornado forecasts to the public, which led to this incident. So the investigation concluded with a recommendation for Fawbush and Miller to promptly fix that. For the next 3 days, Miller, Fawbush, and Commanding General Fred S. Borum would analyze the surrounding upper air charts prior to the March 20th tornado, comparing them with charts of conditions of preceding tornado events, noting similarities in temperature, barometric pressure, winds, humidity, and lifting mechanisms. They then listed several severe weather parameters that they considered to be sufficient for tornado production to occur when all were present simultaneously. They felt confident in this, as they established these rules for a forecasting process, but this process wouldn't wait to be tested by any other forecasters, because only a few days later, on March 25th of 1948, only 5 days since the first tornado struck the Air Force Base, Miller begins to notice quite a similar pattern in that morning's atmospheric conditions that mirrored the ones of March 20th. Miller and Fawbush begin to realize that the central Oklahoma region was in the primary risk area for a tornado threat that evening. After much consideration and debate, the three men eventually decide that if there was ever going to be a time to issue a tornado forecast, that the conditions would never be more similar than to do it for that very night. And although they knew the possibility of the base being hit by a second tornado in 5 days was one in several million, they did it anyways. Within minutes, the first official tornado forecast was typed up, issued, and the base began disseminating preparation instructions and carrying out the general's tornado safety plan. In the coming hours, with zero reports of damaging winds or tornadoes in the state, the two men begin to think that their forecast was made in error. In fact, Miller actually drove home as he thought that nothing would materialize from this event. But as God or fate would have it, shortly after Miller leaves work, another tornado strikes Tinker Air Force Base. Miller, who only hears of this news in a very short radio bulletin about a destructive tornado, is taken aback. He quickly drives back to work and found the path leading into the Air Force Base was in chaos, with utility poles and debris everywhere. Miller finally reaches Fawbush, who is described as being jubilant, not only at his personal witness of the raw power of a tornado up close, but at the fact that they had successfully predicted the storm and saved not only all of the people at the Air Force Base, but all of the equipment as well. This is technically both noted in the National Weather Service's history website as being the first official tornado forecast and the first official tornado warning of sorts. And normally when you read this story in any article or publication, that's typically where the tornado forecasting story starts and ends. This incredibly captivating tale of a miraculous tornado forecast and the two meteorologists who made it happen after the event. But the truth is that wasn't the end of the story, and this wasn't even the real start of tornado forecasting being implemented. In fact, the next tornado forecast issued by Miller and Fawbush would be in March of 1949, which was once again successful. Following the success of the first tornado warning issued by Fawbush and Miller, the United States Weather Bureau at the very least does technically lift the ban on the word tornado and its long-standing policy against the use of the word in public forecasts and warnings. Largely though, the United States Weather Bureau refuses to accept tornado forecasting as a sound or reliable methodology, though technically, with the lift of the ban on the word tornado, local Weather Bureau offices are allowed to issue tornado warnings, but these largely begin for military bases rather than for the general public. We're now in 1952. The Weather Bureau is in hot water because the public is now beginning to understand that something is amiss with tornado forecasting and warnings. In fact, as the spring and summer tornado season of 1952 approached, tensions continued to increase. The glaring reality of the Weather Bureau's intentions to not warn citizens would come to a head on March 3rd, when a series of tornadoes strike parts of Georgia and Alabama, and locals realized that a separate forecasting branch called the SWWC was leaking information on tornado forecasts and warnings to the public, while the government local Weather Bureau offices with the same meteorological knowledge and privy to the same data chose to not warn or forecast for the major tornado outbreak that happened on March 3rd of that year. This all culminates to later in the year, the Severe Local Storms Unit, known as SELS, would be established within the United States Weather Bureau. This unit, which is the predecessor to the modern-day SPC, was the first national entity dedicated to forecasting severe storms, including tornadoes. That same year, the SELS unit begins issuing tornado watches, which were initially called tornado forecasts that we've been talking about. These terms for some time would be quite interchangeable, which is a little bit different from the very specific terminology that we're used to using today. So now, finally, after years of pushback and controversy, the Weather Bureau in the spring of 1952 decides to quietly begin issuing tornado forecasts from the SELS unit. All of this initial reasoning as to why they refused to believe in tornado forecasts as a valid science and practice was because they didn't want to issue forecasts that wouldn't be accurate most of the time. And they were willing to die on that hill and almost did. On March 21st of 1952, we get the first tornado forecast from Washington, D.C., effective for the residents of southeastern Oklahoma. The front page of the Arkansas Democrat contained a notice that said, quote, "Numerous thunderstorms are possible and isolated tornadoes are possible in the forecast tonight in southern Arkansas." This forecast eventually verified, and during the afternoon and evening hours of March 21st, 17 tornadoes took the lives of over 200 citizens of Arkansas, Tennessee, Missouri, and Mississippi. Over 100 of the fatalities occurred in areas of Missouri and Arkansas that weren't even near the forecast area. But again, a step forward for the public nonetheless. In just a few years, we've made huge leaps and bounds for tornado science and public safety. And largely the catalyst for some of the major sweeping changes in 1953 boiled down to the 1953 Flint Beecher tornado. This F5 twister in Michigan on June 8th took the lives of 116 residents and injured more than 800. This tornado, combined with a series of deadly outbreaks in that year, helped to really convince the public and the government that tornado warnings were necessary to save lives. It was also after the Flint Beecher tornado that civil defense authorities in Michigan and in other states began seriously advocating for public warning systems, including the adaptation of sirens for weather alerts. Many of you are already familiar with the fact that the first tornado sirens that were used came from 1930s and 1940s air raid sirens installed in many U.S. cities during the buildup of and throughout World War II. And those sirens are slowly being implemented, particularly in the plains and parts of the Midwest. We also should consider and talk about why there were plenty of areas that didn't immediately adopt tornado sirens. We can't pretend that the integration of sirens in the United States was solely because of tornadoes. It wasn't. By 1955, we are only 1 decade removed from the end of World War II, and between 1948 to 1953 is considered to be one of the peaks of Cold War tensions. These tensions would continue and ultimately would culminate again in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So at this point in American history, air raid sirens, or sirens generally, are deeply integrated in the minds of Americans as the threat of looming war and impending doom and attack. Not every area immediately wanted to implement sirens for tornado use, and you can see where this was a tricky time in history for the average American to navigate. There were several points in history, particularly during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where there were plenty of American cities that chose not to do tornado warning siren testing for the entire fall and winter period during the Cuban Missile Crisis because they didn't want to risk confusion and panic for the locals over why the sirens might be sounding. The 1970s. This is the decade that we go from somewhat of the Wild West in terms of early tornado alerting to a much more coordinated national system with major developments in radar, policy, and public outreach. Starting the decade off strong in 1970, the United States Weather Bureau becomes the National Weather Service under the newly formed National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Radar technology significantly improves in the 70s as well, not only with the expansion of the WSR-57, but the introduction of the WSR-74 network. Meanwhile, Dr. Ted Fujita becomes much more active in his tornado research, starting in 1970 with his groundbreaking research on the 1970 Lubbock F5. His tornado theories, crafted from the 1970 Lubbock tornado and from the 1974 super outbreak, would lead to the most prolific system of tornado rating used to this very day, the Pearson-Fujita scale. Tornado watches and warnings become firmly defined in the 1970s, with tornado watches issued by the CELS unit, the predecessor to the SPC, and tornado warnings being issued by local National Weather Service offices when tornadoes were occurring or imminent. This terminology and process is something we adhere to this very day. It's also in the 70s that the use of the term take cover is popularized, and it's undeniable that the progression that happens in the 1970s is derived from prolific outbreaks, most notably from the 1974 super outbreak. The 1974 super outbreak fast-tracks the investments in the WSR-74 radar networks, and other notable events would eventually drive schools, communities, and civil defense agencies to start building out tornado drills, tornado shelters, and public education campaigns to drive people to be more aware of tornado safety. This decade also saw the rise of the NOAA Weather Radio, which became the official voice of the National Weather Service, offering the public its first direct from source warning system, a massive step forward in accessibility and preparedness.
Don't gamble with a tornado watch. The stakes are too high. When you hear the watch, your ESSA Weather Bureau urges you to alert your neighbors and be sure members of your family stay near a safe shelter. Don't take unnecessary risks.
Moving now into the 1980s, this is another decade of consistency after rapid sweeping changes. In April of 1982, we get the first PDS tornado watch and wording. It was used to differentiate the upper echelon tornado days to emergency managers and the public from the, let's say, average tornado threat. And while the 1980s didn't perfect the PDS language that we have today with the consistency of it, it is the beginnings of making some types of differentiation for the magnitude of the tornado threat that the sales unit believes is possible for that day. And while the consistency for tornado warnings is there, lead times are often short and false alarm rates are frequently high. The 1990s is another decade that I'm going to argue is one of the most consequential and prolific for the advancement of tornado forecasting. More importantly, though, the 1990s starts off with arguably the most prolific and sweeping change of the decade, which is the implementation of the WSR-88D NEXRAD radars. The rollout of the NEXRAD radars begins in 1992, eventually being completed nationwide by 1997, but they are so critical because they are Doppler radars. And Doppler radars let forecasters detect mesocyclones, rotation, and tornadic vortex signatures, even without a visual confirmation. The ability to detect the velocity of storms with these NEXRAD radars was nothing short of industry changing. They now have the ability to look at the velocity of the storm in addition to the reflectivity, and then make a decision to issue a tornado warning based on that alone. And it's difficult to overstate just how impactful this was to tornado warning history. It's also in the 1990s that we get a more pointed standardization of language that begins to occur. Now warnings will all begin with language like, quote, radar indicated rotation in a storm, and this would eventually evolve into the radar indicated tornado tags that we know and use today. We also see the emergence of technology really drastically shaping the weather enterprise. Pagers, TV crawlers, and the earliest forms of computer-based alerting are beginning to appear. And of course, the beginnings of the emergence of the internet, which are going to drastically play a role in the weather enterprise as well. Tornado warnings also begin to shift from free-form general text to a more template-based message. And tornado warnings now also include very specific points like storm motion or specific geographical references. But I also think it's important when we talk about the context of tornado warnings in the 1990s that we of course have to talk about the prolific tornadoes of the 90s. Starting out in 1990 with the Plainfield event. While not as overtly obvious, the Plainfield event majorly shaped the way that forecasters approached warning for tornadoes. For those of you who aren't familiar, the 1990 Plainfield event is a very infamous instance in the weather community of a violent F5 tornado that occurred with zero tornado warning for the public and was very deadly. This event was so prolific in the community that it gave rise to what's colloquially known as the Plainfield effect to forecasters, which is essentially the idea that it is much better to overwarn for tornadoes than it is to underwarn an event and to have something like the Plainfield event happen and for a loss of life to happen. There was a major investigation that happened by the National Weather Service after the Plainfield event that majorly dissected what went wrong and how they needed to improve moving forward, and they certainly did from this event, but I'd be remiss not to mention how much it impacted the forecasting community in the early 90s. And with the rise of the WSRD NEXRAD radars and with things like the Plainfield event happening, there's now this newer conversation that begins happening in the 1990s that's going to carry on to this very day, and that is the notion of the cry wolf effect. As technology continued to increase in the 1990s, as it does today, so too do the tornado warnings that are issued, i.e. the abundance of radar-indicated tornado warnings that are issued and the rise of the false alarm rates that we frequently still talk about to this very day, as I have talked about extensively. Outside of the Plainfield event creating moral dilemmas for forecasters, we also had incredible events like the 1991 Andover tornado, which was one of the first times ever that a violent tornado was recorded in high definition up close and able to be seen by the rest of the world, which was quite shocking. And of course, the most infamous hallmark event of the decade was unquestionably the 1999 Bridge Creek Moore tornado, which was not only one of the most prolific events of the entire century, but it also created the very first tornado emergency in history, which was a major step forward for the tornado warning process, albeit born from a place of complete horror and devastation. We're now going to shift into the 21st century and what I'm going to call the digital shift. In 2006, the Storm Prediction Center begins issuing probabilistic tornado outlooks as a part of their day one convective outlooks. It's also during this period that we get the implementation of the polygon-based warning rather than the county-based warning that was previously used. Of the many prolific events of the early aughts, one of the most notable is the May 4th, 2007 Greensburg, Kansas EF5 tornado, which was the first tornado with a 100% dual pole signature for debris. 11 people lost their lives in the small community of Greensburg, Kansas, and this was one of the first tornadoes ever to be rated using the new enhanced Fujita tornado rating system. By the late 2000s, the groundwork for dual polarization radar is being laid, though full implementation didn't arrive until around 2011 into 2013. Moving now into the 2010s, the focus of the Sirens shifts from the loud noise, high decibel of previous tornado sirens to clear communication, particularly for public places like parks or schools. We also have a major shift to the smartphone as a way for the average American to get tornado warnings, watches, and all of their severe weather information. The rise of the internet, smartphones, and apps will completely alter the weather enterprise and change how people receive and perceive weather warnings. 2012 is another big year for the advancement of technology, as it is the first year that the National Weather Service undertakes the IBW or Impact-Based Warning System. These tags, for example, for a tornado warning would include whether the tornado was radar indicated or observed. They could also include a hail tag indicating what size hail would be, and the damage threat tag, which would note whether a storm was capable of producing considerable or catastrophic damage. Stepping back for a second though, of course I want to talk about the impact of the 2011 super outbreak. While there are usually quite a few comparisons on the cultural impact of the 2011 super outbreak and the 1974 super outbreak, my opinion is that while the 1974 outbreak saw a push for a lot more technological innovation and improvements with radar, the 2011 super outbreak, in my opinion, gave a much bigger push to shaping the way or changing the way that the average person saw or perceived tornadoes and outbreaks. It gave way to a much larger cultural and social shift of the weather enterprise. The 2011 super outbreak was heavily televised, live for the entire world to see, majorly devastating across a wide swath of the southeastern United States, and was in the news cycle for much longer than the average singular tornado event. The 2011 outbreak was promptly followed by the Joplin event just a few weeks later, and Joplin, of course, was another prolific singular event that stayed in the news cycle for a much longer time, and in my opinion changed the way that just the average person saw and experienced and perceived tornadoes. That is just my personal theory on the implications of the 2011 super outbreak. And again, while there wasn't specific technological investments immediately after the 2011 and 2013 tornado seasons like the ones that happened in 1974, there certainly was a lot of social shifts and certainly continuous improvement from the National Weather Service itself in the 2010s and into now the 2020s. So taking a look at where we are now in tornado forecasting and what it means currently and what it will mean in the future, we're certainly going to continue on the road of technological advancement. Right now, we are currently seeing the experimental NOAA initiative called the WOFS, or the Warn On Forecast System, which is an experiment that aims to extend tornado warning times. Notably, during the May 2024 Greenfield, Iowa EF4, that wicked monster, WOFS provided a 75-minute advanced warning for Greenfield, showcasing its potential for much earlier alerts. What does the future of tornado warnings look like? Of course, I can't know, but we can take a few guesses. Of course, the natural assumption is that artificial intelligence and algorithms and models will be able to take certain environmental parameters and historical logs and compile those into very sophisticated systems that can predict to whatever accuracy rate tornadoes and storms, or the risk of a storm turning tornadic, and those do exist already to an extent. We are certainly going to be having the advanced warning time debate in the future, which is right up my alley of interest, which is risk perception and behavioral science. We're only going to continue to see more integration with computer-based models and AI, and I hope with more inclusion of that, we are also able to take those technologies and make warnings and shelters more accessible for underserved communities. I hope that we are able to address the issues of sheltering and mobile homes, and I have faith that we will get there. What about you, Beep? I think I've said everything I want to say on that front. I think we will continue to see improvement as we move forward. That's my guess. Wow, that was a lot of history for tornado warnings. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching this far. I think that's all I have. I had really wanted to make a PowerPoint presentation on the wall type video, and I filmed it twice unsuccessfully and it didn't look very good. So maybe I'll make that vision happen next time and I'll do more testing on it because I think it would be fun and a little bit different. But that is all I have for this one. Let me know what you all thought about it in the comments down below. And that's it. I will see you all in the next one. Bye. The biggest aviation administration. Is that right? It's not aviation. National Oceanic and beep. Why are you getting into trouble over there? 거기서 뭐 하는 거야? 나. Beep. 뭘 봐? 뭘 봐, 이 새끼. The mystery. Curiosity. No, that wasn't it either. Europe. Why did I say Europe? I'm becoming that lipstick auntie that has smudged lipstick all over the place. I'm about that age, I guess.